Hey there. Welcome to Sleepy Pedia. I'm Michael, your narrator for the night.
Where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it where you are?
Drop a comment below, and let's get started. Chapter 1. Two Giants Rise.
The morning light spilled gently across the southern edge of the Mediterranean, where the city of Carthage sat, nestled like a jewel against the sea. Long before it would be known for war elephants and epic battles, Carthage began with ships and trade winds. It was not born of conquest, but of commerce. A daughter of Tyre, the great Phoenician city to the east, Carthage was planted by mariners who followed the stars and coastlines far from home, looking for ports and promise. They brought with them not only goods, precious dyes, ivory, metals, but the soul of a merchant people, fluent in the language of tide and barter. What rose from this colony was something uniquely adaptive. Carthage learned to thrive by understanding the sea, by moving where wind and profit carried them. Its ships grew sleeker, faster, its harbours deepened with use, and its people became expert at navigating both the ocean and the tangled politics of the coast. Over time, they became more than a port, they became a power. With little farmland to rely upon, Carthage invested in colonies and alliances across North Africa, Spain, and the islands of the western Mediterranean. They built walls, towers, and docks, not merely to defend, but to welcome and regulate trade. Their coins bore images of palm trees and horses, symbols of both life and speed, both sacred and practical. Their gods were old, carried from Phoenicia. Baal-Hamon, lord of the sky, and Tanit, goddess of life. Fires burned in their honour, and temples stood beside warehouses as commerce and worship coexisted in this bustling city of sails and smoke. Carthage was not aggressive in the Roman sense. It did not crave territory for glory. Instead, it sought control over lanes, over silence between islands, over the winds that carried spices and slaves. It was an empire not of soldiers, but of navigators. And yet, as their reach extended, so too did the shadows of new threats. For even in the calm waters of prosperity, danger can approach unseen, rising not from the sea, but from across it. To the north, away from the coast and away from trade winds, another city took shape: Rome. Its foundation was not laid by merchants, but by warriors, shepherds, and farmers. It was not founded for profit, but for survival. Built on 7 hills near the bend of the Tiber River, Rome was a patchwork of tribes, beliefs, and stubborn endurance. Where Carthage looked to the sea, Rome looked inward and upward, toward the land, the gods of hearth and field, and toward an identity still being formed. In its earliest days, Rome was small and vulnerable. It knew the sting of foreign kings, the humiliation of defeat, the hunger of winter. But these scars did not break it. They shaped it. The Romans learned discipline as a necessity. Their legions, in time, would become the finest military force the world had seen, but at first, they were simply farmers who learned to fight and refused to flee. Honour, loyalty, and service to the Republic became sacred. Rome's Republic was a strange invention for its time, a shared power structure where senators debated and consuls led not as kings but as elected guardians. It was not perfect, nor was it entirely fair, but it worked. And it gave Rome something Carthage never truly had: a deep sense of unity in sacrifice. Every victory came with cost, and every cost was remembered. They fought neighbours, rebels, and invaders, Etruscans, Samnites, Gauls. Every war was brutal, but every war brought lessons. They built roads not just to move, but to conquer. They built colonies not just to settle, but to bind distant regions into one Roman heart. And while Carthage perfected the sea, Rome conquered the land. Their expansion was slow but relentless. They did not drift on winds, they marched. And with every step, their shadow stretched further. Rome did not yet know Carthage, but Carthage would soon know Rome. A world apart. The two cities in their ascent seemed to grow in different worlds. One danced with the currents, the other carved its name into stone. Culturally, they shared little. Carthage spoke the language of the Phoenicians, a flowing script written on scrolls of papyrus and clay tablets. Rome spoke Latin, hard and precise, etched in marble and lore. Carthaginian religion was old and veiled in mystery, with rituals that frightened outsiders, sacrifices and symbols, prayers whispered into the sea breeze. Roman religion, by contrast, was orderly, public and structured, a mirror of their society. They believed in omens, in household gods, in signs from birds and thunder. Even their economies reflected this divide. Carthage dealt in ships and goods, in silver from Iberian mines and tin from the north. Rome thrived on land, on crops and slaves, on tribute from conquered people. And yet, despite their differences, they shared something far more dangerous: ambition. Carthage wanted stability across the Western Sea, a silent control over trade and islands, harbours and routes. Rome wanted safety on its borders, but also honour, influence, and eventually, more. The two powers were not at war, they had even traded. But beneath that polite distance, the seeds of tension grew. Each watched the other from afar, aware but not alarmed. Rome noticed Carthage's ships circling Sicily. Carthage noticed Roman troops expanding ever closer to the coast. No insult had yet been traded, but in history, great wars do not always begin with anger. Often, they begin with awareness. The edge of contact. The point where these two empires would finally meet was not on their native soil. It was Sicily, a fertile island that lay between them like a stone in shallow water. Carthage had long held influence there, trading posts, alliances, and quiet power. Rome, having secured much of the Italian mainland, now looked across the strait with curiosity and caution. Sicily was no empty land. It was contested, crowded with Greek city-states, native tribes, and rival ambitions. For years, Carthage and local Greek powers had played a delicate balance, each checking the other. But Rome's arrival tipped the scale. It was not meant to be a declaration of war, only a move to protect Italian allies, but to Carthage it felt like an intrusion. As Rome sent envoys, Carthage sent warnings. As one side fortified a city, the other blockaded a port. The air grew heavy, not yet with battle cries, but with watchful silence. There was still time to turn back, to negotiate, to avoid what history would call the Punic Wars, but neither side wanted to retreat. Carthage feared a Roman foothold too close to Africa. Rome feared a Carthaginian dominance of the sea, and Sicily, caught between these two powers, became the match that would ignite a firestorm across centuries. So it was in the golden haze of the 3rd century before Christ that two mighty empires stood at the edge of contact. Not yet enemies, but no longer strangers. Not yet at war, but no longer at peace. Their paths have been long and different. Their values, their gods, their ways of life, so distant, so unlike, and yet their fates now moved toward the same narrow strait, the same contested shore. History does not rush. It waits, it simmers, and then it moves. And in the waters near Sicily, history had begun to stir. Chapter 2. The Mercenaries of Messina. In the shadowed corners of the Mediterranean world, history sometimes turns not by the hands of mighty emperors or noble leaders, but by those cast out from both. The Mamertines were such men, wanderers, soldiers without countries, survivors of forgotten wars. Their name came from the war god Mars, and they wore it like armour, fierce and proud. But pride, unanchored by loyalty, can drift into something darker. Once hired as mercenaries to serve the ruler of Syracuse, these men were trusted to guard a city, to keep peace in exchange for coin. But when their employer died, the Mamertines saw an opportunity. Instead of leaving, they turned their blades on the city of Messina, taking it for themselves. The peaceful town became their fortress. Its homes, its temples, its people, all fell under their rule. They were not kings, but they acted like ones. With no homeland but what they stole, they lived by the sword and feared retribution. Their grasp on Messina was firm but not secure. Syracuse, their former patron and now enemy, threatened to reclaim the city. The Mamertines could not face them alone. Desperate, they sent envoys to two powers. Not one, but two. One was Carthage, the guardian of the seas. The other was Rome, the rising force across the strait. It was not a smart move. It was a gamble, a cry for survival disguised as diplomacy. They did not expect both powers to answer, but both did. For Rome and Carthage, Sicily was more than an island. It was a doorway to security, to expansion, to dominance. The Mamertines had struck a match in a forest of dry leaves. What began as a small act of desperation, thieves seeking protectors, quickly became the spark that would ignite one of the longest and bloodiest wars in ancient history. Carthage steps in. Carthage was first to respond. Swift and silent, they sailed across the waters and arrived in Messina. Their decision was not sentimental, it was strategic. Holding Messina meant controlling a vital point at the northeastern tip of Sicily. It watched over the narrow sea between Italy and the island like a gate. For Carthage, it was better to keep it under their eye than risk Roman interference. They sent a garrison, a force both symbolic and practical. Their soldiers took up positions in the city, raising the Carthaginian standard alongside the walls. To the Mamertines it was relief, to Syracuse it was a threat, and to Rome it was a challenge. Carthage acted with their usual precision. No fanfare, no declarations. Their message was quiet but clear. We are here, now. The soldiers they stationed were not invaders in their eyes but stabilizers. They claimed to be preventing chaos, yet the Roman Senate saw something different. They saw movement, encroachment. The sea between Italy and Sicily, once a buffer, now seemed narrow and dangerous. With Carthage holding Messina, their ships could sail closer than ever to the Italian coast. For a republic that guarded its territory with obsessive care, this was not acceptable. Even so, Carthage did not expect Rome to act. They believed the Romans would protest, perhaps grumble in the Senate halls, but ultimately stay on their side of the water. After all, would Rome risk war over mercenaries, over criminals who had seized a city? Carthage had underestimated just how far Rome would go to defend influence and pride. Rome debates war. In the city of Rome, the news of Carthage's move landed like a stone in still water. The Senate gathered, wise men in white togas, voices raised not in anger but in careful consideration. It was not a simple matter. The Mamertines were no heroes, they had taken Messina by force. To assist them would be to align with thieves. It would be, some said, dishonourable. But honour is not always the guiding star of politics. Others in the Senate saw further. If Carthage stayed in Messina, it would be the beginning of something much greater, a foothold too close for comfort. Today it was Sicily, tomorrow perhaps the Italian mainland. The senators debated not only morality, but survival. There was no easy consensus. The Republic had not yet faced Carthage in open war. Their interactions had been tense but peaceful. A war would not be brief, it would not be cheap, and it would not be bloodless. Still, the idea that Carthage might control both the sea and Sicily filled many with quiet dread. In the end, Rome chose action. It was not just about the Mamertines, it was about presence, about influence, about making sure that no foreign power, no matter how distant, would dictate the shape of Roman borders. So the Senate voted, and they voted for war. They did not call it that. Not at first. They called it aid, assistance, a necessary step. But every senator knew what it meant. By choosing to send soldiers across the sea, Rome crossed more than water. They crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The first landing. Under the quiet cover of night, Roman ships slicked through the waves of the strait. The moon hung pale above them, casting silver light on water stirred by soft winds. Soldiers stood ready, not seasoned in ocean journeys, but firm in their purpose. They were the first Romans to cross the narrow sea, the first to set foot on Sicilian soil as invaders, not allies. Messina rose ahead of them, a dark silhouette against the lighter sky. Somewhere within, Carthaginian troops kept watch. Somewhere nearby, Syracuse waited to see which power would hold the city. But for now, the Romans moved in silence, their landing careful, their formation steady. The ground beneath their boots was foreign, but the mission was clear. Secure the city remove the Carthaginian garrison, restore control to the Mamertines, or at least appear to. What followed was not a grand battle, but a tense shift. The Carthaginian forces, seeing the arrival of Rome, withdrew from Messina. Some reports suggest it was done to avoid escalation, others say it was a calculated step, to observe how far Rome would go. Regardless, the city was left in Roman hands.
And just like that, the balance tipped. No longer was it a local conflict. It had become a moment that echoed through every corridor of power, from Rome's Capitoline Hill to Carthage's council halls. The Romans had landed, and they had stayed. It would not be the last landing. It would not be the last time Messina would tremble beneath the march of soldiers, but it was the first. And in the long memory of history, firsts carry weight. The Mamertines, once mercenaries, then rulers, now pawns, faded into the background as giants stirred around them. They had asked for help. What they brought instead was war. A war that would stretch across decades, from island to mainland, from sea to sky. A war that would test the strength of two civilizations. And it began not with a declaration, but with a quiet crossing under the moon. Chapter 3: The War of Elephants and Grain. The winds over Sicily had changed. No longer whispers between merchants or cautious footsteps of emissaries. Now it was the rhythm of war drums and the deep thunder of marching feet. The city of Agrigentum, perched along the southern coast of the island, stood like a citadel between two worlds. For years it had been a Carthaginian stronghold, rich with grain fields and guarded by stone walls, but now it found itself encircled by a new force. The Romans had come. Not with small parties or scouts, but with an army. A full legion, disciplined and prepared, had crossed the strait and moved inland with quiet purpose. Their target was not simply to harass Carthaginian allies, it was to break them, and Agrigentum was the test. This siege was not swift, it was not flashy, it was slow, methodical, and meant to strangle. The Roman general Lucius Postumus Megellus began the blockade with caution. Trenches were dug, supply lines secured, and a ring of camps began to close around the city like a tightening noose. In time, another Roman commander, Quintus Mamilius Vitellius, joined him. Together they oversaw the first real collision of the two powers on land. Carthage did not ignore the threat. A relief force was sent under the command of Hanno, one of their more seasoned generals. He brought with him not only infantry, but elephants, creatures that symbolized Carthage's unique strength. Towering and strange to Roman eyes, these animals were not just for battle, they were a message, a display of power from a world Rome had not yet fully understood. What began as a siege turned into a standoff. Two great armies, face to face, and between them, a city holding its breath. The grain stores inside Agrigentum grew thinner by the day. The hills outside trembled beneath the weight of soldiers and siege engines. This was no longer a border dispute. This was war, full and declared. The mercenary mosaic. Carthage's army was like a living map of the Mediterranean. Within its ranks were not just Carthaginians, but Numidians from Africa, Iberians from Spain, Gauls from the north, and Greeks from scattered islands. It was an empire stitched together with gold, contracts, and promises. These were mercenaries, men who fought not for loyalty, but for pay. Some rode on horseback, nimble and quick. Others marched with long spears and round shields, chanting in tongues foreign to one another. The officers spoke in multiple languages, each trying to command a patchwork of cultures, customs, and motivations. It made for a striking sight, a mosaic of war, beautiful in form but fragile in function. While their skill was not in question, their unity was. Orders were misunderstood, alliances within the army shifted with rumour, and the loyalty of some mercenaries grew thin as the siege dragged on. Rome, in contrast, relied on its legions, men from Italian soil, trained in the same way, drilled side by side, and bound by discipline. Carthage's strength was in diversity, but in this siege it became a burden. The Roman blockade tested not only the walls of Agrigentum, but the bonds between those sworn to defend it. When food began to run short, tensions inside the Carthaginian camp rose. Commanders argued, soldiers murmured, the elephants stood still, majestic but unused, as if waiting for clearer orders that never came.
Hanno attempted several sallies, short, violent strikes to disrupt the Roman lines, but the coordination was lacking. The relief force could not break the siege, and the defenders inside the city could not hold out forever. As the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months, the strength of Carthage's mercenaries began to fade. Not from battle, but from disunity. Smoke over the hills. From within the city walls, the people of Agrigentum watched the smoke rise beyond the hills. It was not the smoke of victory, but of desperation. Cookfires dwindling, stores shrinking, and fear growing. The Roman legions outside did not attack recklessly. They waited. They starved the city slowly, forcing it to consume itself. Starvation changed everything. The defenders grew thin, civilians whispered prayers to gods that no longer answered. Horses, once symbols of nobility, were eaten, hope became brittle. At night, the streets were quiet. The cries of children echoed against the stone. Rome, too, paid a price for patience. The siege strained their supplies as well. The Sicilian landscape, rich in wheat and olives, had been stripped bare by months of conflict. Roman soldiers grew weary, not of battle, but of waiting. Disease crept into the camps. Restless nights turned into arguments. The discipline that bound them was tested. Yet the siege held. The Roman lines were firm. Carthage's relief attempts grew less frequent. The elephants, once a threat, became symbols of inaction. Inside the city, the last reserves of food were measured in handfuls. Messengers were sent out under the cover of darkness, seeking aid, any aid, but none came. And so the defenders cried for help once more, and none answered. The hills around Agrigentum stood silent, scarred by trenches and filled with smoke. The city, once a proud Carthaginian post, was now a place of shadows and hunger. Rome was winning, not with speed but with silence. It was a lesson in patience, and in the cost of endurance. A bloody lesson. When the walls finally gave way, the end was not clean. The Roman assault on Agrigentum was brutal. The city, weak from within, offered little resistance. The defenders were too hungry to fight, too broken to hold the line. The gates fell, and Roman legions surged in. Weak, rundle, and wake complex. But victory came at a price that stained their reputation. The civilians of Agrigentum, not just soldiers but women, children and elders, were caught in the chaos. Rome, having waited so long, unleashed its fury. Streets filled with screams, temples were looted, homes burned. The city that had begged for survival was offered none. The massacre shocked even some Roman commanders. It was not supposed to be this way. The objective had been strategic: secure a foothold, send a message. But the violence sent another kind of message, one not written in policy, but in blood. Allies in Sicily began to shift. Some who had considered siding with Rome now hesitated. Carthaginian allies, once doubtful, found a new reason to resist. The Romans had shown their strength, but they had also shown their ruthlessness. In Rome, the news of victory was celebrated, but beneath the cheers, some questioned the cost. Was this the kind of war they were to fight? Was this the beginning of something they could control, or something that would consume them? Agrigentum was a success on paper, a major Carthaginian city taken, their first true land battle won. But in its ashes a lesson smouldered. War, once begun, rarely obeys the plans of those who start it. And when elephants and grain are no longer enough, it is the people, always the people, who suffer most. The siege had ended, but the Punic Wars were just beginning. Chapter 4. Ships from Nothing. Rome had always been a land power. Its heart was the soil of Italy, its strength drawn from hills, valleys, and the steady march of legions. The Romans fought on foot, shaped by the land beneath them and trained to conquer it. For generations, the sea was something they respected but did not understand. They had ports but no fleets. They had merchants but no admirals. Their world was built in stone and sweat, not sails and salt water. But the Punic Wars had changed the shape of their world. Carthage, with its proud navy and centuries of seafaring, ruled the Mediterranean like a quiet storm. Its ships moved swiftly, its commanders were veterans of wind and wave. The Romans, watching from the shore, realised that if they wanted to win this war, truly win it, they would have to do what they'd never done before. They would have to fight at sea. Rome had no tradition of naval warfare. Its soldiers were not trained to balance on decks or command from a helm, but this did not stop them. Instead, it stirred something deeper, the Roman belief that anything could be built if the will was strong enough. So they began. It is said that when they captured a Carthaginian quinquereme, a type of large warship, they studied it carefully. Every plank, every nail, every curve of wood was measured and copied. Roman carpenters, more familiar with wagons than hulls, turned their tools to shipbuilding. Within a year, a fleet had begun to rise from the docks. They trained soldiers to row. Not sailors, soldiers. Men who knew formation and endurance, not tides and currents. It was awkward at first. Their ships were slower, their movements uncoordinated, but they learned. Rome did not expect perfection, it expected progress. And slowly, across the harbours of Italy, wooden giants took shape. Ships, not yet tested by war, but filled with men who knew how to fight, even if not yet how to float. The sea, once Carthage's alone, now held the shadows of Roman ambition. The birth of the Corvus. Rome knew it could not beat Carthage at sea using Carthage's own strengths. They had no seasoned mariners, no long heritage of naval tactics, but they had something else. Creativity shaped by necessity, and so they invented the Corvus. The word meant raven, but this device was not a bird. It was a boarding bridge, a heavy, iron-spiked plank that could swing down from the Roman ship onto an enemy's deck. At its end was a sharp hook, meant to dig deep into the wooden surface and hold the ships together. It was a bold idea. Carthage relied on speed, manoeuvring and ramming. Rome could not match that. But with the Corvus, they didn't have to. Instead of naval manoeuvre, Rome turned sea battles into land battles, something they knew well. When the bridge dropped, Roman infantry would pour across, turning the deck of a ship into a battlefield. The Corvus was more than a tool. It was a message. Rome did not need to learn Carthage's style. It would force Carthage to fight on Roman terms. The early tests were clumsy. The device was heavy and it made the ships more unstable in rough water. But when it worked with brutal efficiency. Carthaginian crews, trained for quick naval skirmishes, suddenly found themselves face to face with Roman legionaries charging across a bridge of iron. The sea had become unfamiliar ground. The Corvus changed everything. It gave Rome an edge where they had none. It showed that even at sea, land tactics could dominate, and most of all, it proved that Rome would not be limited by what it lacked. If the ocean was foreign, they would build bridges across it. The backed naval baptism. With ships in the water and Corvus devices ready, Rome sailed into its first true naval battle. The place was Mylae, a port on the northern coast of Sicily. The Carthaginians, confident as ever, sent their fleet to intercept. They believed this would be a swift and easy victory, a chance to remind Rome that the sea belonged to Carthage. But they were wrong. The Romans, led by the consul Gaius Duilius, were not elegant sailors. Their movements were stiff, their turns wide and delayed. Yet when the enemy approached, they lowered the Corvus, and the nature of the battle shifted. Ship after ship was boarded. Carthaginian crews, confused and cornered, were overwhelmed by the Roman tactic. The chaos of naval warfare became the close-quarters struggle of infantry combat, where Rome thrived. The Carthaginians, unprepared for this brutal change, began to lose control of the fight. By the time the battle ended, Rome had captured or destroyed dozens of enemy ships. The sea, once a realm of fear for the legions, had become a place of pride. They had faced one of the strongest navies in the world and won. Gaius Duilius returned home to triumph. A column was raised in his honour, decorated with the beaks of captured ships. It was a symbol not just of victory, but of transformation. Rome had crossed into a new phase of power. And Carthage, for the first time, realised that the war would not be won as easily as they had hoped. Storms and sacrifices. Victory at sea brought glory, but also grief. As Rome continued to build fleets and test its new naval might, It faced a foe no army could defeat, the sea itself. The Mediterranean, beautiful and blue, could turn cruel without warning. Storms rose with little sign, winds shifted like moods, and Roman ships, built in haste and manned by those still learning the ocean's ways, were vulnerable. In one terrible instant, after another naval success, a Roman fleet was caught in a violent storm while returning to port. Hundreds of ships were dashed against the rocks. Thousands of men, not in battle but in retreat, were swallowed by the waves. The ocean that had just celebrated their courage turned cold and unforgiving. It was a harsh reminder. Rome could copy ships. It could invent weapons. It could even defeat Carthage on water. But it could not control the sea. These disasters did not end Rome's resolve. If anything, they deepened it. More ships were built. More men were trained. The war, for all its early blood, was not slowing. It was only beginning to change. Families in Rome began to see the price of ambition. Sons who had marched home from Sicily now vanished in watery graves. The streets, once filled with cheers, now whispered with mourning. Still, the Senate pressed forward. Still, the shipyards echoed with hammers. For in every Roman heart, one truth had taken root. If they could master the sea, they could master the war. And if the sea demanded sacrifice, then sacrifice it would have. The Corvus had brought them victory. The ocean had brought them loss. Together they shaped the soul of a new Roman navy, forged not just in wood and metal, but in courage, creativity, and the quiet strength to keep going, no matter the storm. Chapter 5. The Island Bleeds. Years passed like falling ash, slow and weightless, yet heavy when gathered. What began as swift marches and bold declarations had turned into something darker. A long, grinding war that refused to end. Sicily, once called the jewel of the Mediterranean, had become a battleground soaked in sorrow. The fields, once lush with wheat and vines, now lay broken beneath boots and siege engines. Cities that once bustled with trade and festivals were reduced to rubble or silence. The war did not move in grand arcs anymore. It crawled, and in its path it left decay. The grain stores dwindled. Carthage, cut off from easy supply by Rome's growing fleet, struggled to send enough food across the sea. Rome, for all its discipline, also felt the pressure, not just of arms, but of time. Soldiers who had once been young and eager now stood older, tired, hardened by years without clear reward. Many had never known peace since they enlisted. For some, the battlefield had become home, and not by choice. Mud filled the trenches. Walls, once built to inspire, cracked and leaned under the weight of repeated assaults. Bodies buried in shallow graves gave rise to sickness. Winter winds offered no favour to either side. The war no longer thrilled anyone, it haunted them. And still, they fought. For neither Rome nor Carthage could back down, not for pride, and not for fear of what surrender would mean. The war on Sicily was not a campaign now. It was a wound, and no one could remember what the island had looked like before it bled. Syracuse chooses. Amid the ruin, one city remained powerful, Syracuse. It had watched from the sidelines, playing a careful game, measuring the strength of each side. Its king, Hero II, was not a man of rash decisions. His city was proud, wealthy, and still untouched by full invasion. But no city could remain neutral forever. He chose who was unto lo the cove. Syracuse had once leaned toward Carthage. It shared trade routes, cultural ties, and a fear of Roman expansion. But years of war had changed everything. Carthage, once the undisputed master of the sea, now struggled to supply its allies. Roman ships patrolled the coast. Roman armies held strong positions near Syracuse. The tides had shifted. Hero saw the signs. To side with Carthage now would be to gamble his city's future on a partner losing ground. And so he made a choice, not of loyalty but of survival. He aligned Syracuse with Rome. It was a quiet shift, but a major one. Syracuse became a Roman ally, not just in word but in deed. Its gates opened to Roman troops. Its stores of grain fed the legions. Its walls became part of the Roman front. In return, Rome recognized Hero as a friend and protector of the Republic. They spared his city, honored his rule, and promised stability.
It was a rare act of diplomacy in a war ruled by steel, and it gave Rome a firm anchor in the east of the island. The Carthaginians saw this move as a betrayal. The balance had tilted further, and though no great battle came from it, the loss of Syracuse echoed louder than many victories. For in war, alliances shape the end as much as weapons do. And now, one of Sicily's greatest cities had chosen a side, not because it believed in Roman glory, but because it believed it had no other choice. The spirit of Sicily. Through all the campaigns and shifting alliances, it was the people of Sicily who suffered most. Not the generals who planned from tents, but the farmers who buried their tools. Not the merchants who once counted coins, but the mothers who now counted the days since their sons had disappeared. The war had outlasted every season. It had touched every valley and climbed every slope. Children born after the first landing in Messina had learned to walk amid rubble. What once was home became a battlefield. What once was faith became a question. Hossa, temples were turned into forts. Grain fields burned and grew again only to burn once more. The very rhythms of Sicilian life, planting, harvest, prayer and peace, were broken. Families fled cities only to find armies on the roads. Villages changed hands so often that the people no longer cheered or wept, they simply waited for orders. But amid the despair, there remained a kind of endurance. The people adapted. They hid their food beneath floors. They learned to speak carefully when soldiers passed. They lit candles, not just for the dead, but for the hope of normalcy returning. And in this quiet, stubborn survival, a different war was being fought, not one of swords, but of spirit. Sicily was more than a chessboard for empires. It was alive. It remembered peace, and it longed for it. The armies had claimed its soil, but the soul of the island belonged to those who still tilled its earth, whispered old songs, and dared to dream beyond the next march of boots. In their silence was resistance. In their patience, power. A pause, not a peace. After years of slow agony, both sides began to talk. Not with trust, and not with any real belief that peace would last, but because even war has its moments of breath. Rome, though gaining ground, was weary. Carthage, though still dangerous, was stretched thin. The war had become costly in ways neither side had expected. Ships lost to storms, fortresses taken and retaken, allies uncertain, and, worst of all, no end in sight. So emissaries met, words were exchanged, proposals floated like ships in shallow water, fragile, drifting, easily broken. No treaty was signed, no final terms declared, but there was a pause, an exhale, a quiet space between battles. Some cities dared to rebuild. Some fields were ploughed again, but no one believed it would last. Beneath the surface, the war still burned. Carthage had not forgotten the insult of lost ground. Rome had not forgotten the hunger of wounded pride. And so what came was not a peace. It was a waiting, a silence between storms, a chance for both sides to prepare for what they knew must come next. The people of Sicily watched it all with tired eyes. They had heard promises before. They had seen peace rise like morning fog, only to vanish before midday. But for a brief moment the sky held fewer ashes, the hills heard fewer cries, and though the war had not ended, it had slowed. Enough for breath, enough for memory, enough to remind those still alive that history, though often cruel, still moves in waves, and even pain has a rhythm. The island did not heal, but it rested. Chapter 6. The Shadow of Sardinia. The war in Sicily had ended, but the pain had not. For years, Carthaginian generals had hired mercenaries from across Africa and the Mediterranean, fierce fighters who had no homeland, only the promise of silver. These men had bled and died for Carthage, but now, in the uneasy stillness after the First Punic War, that promise remained unpaid. The coffers of Carthage were nearly empty. The Senate delayed, debated, and then tried to bargain down what they owed. The mercenaries, once honoured for their bravery, were treated like a nuisance, a debt to be negotiated, not warriors to be respected. At first, the soldiers waited patiently. They were stationed outside the city walls,
just far enough to be kept at arm's length. But food was scarce. Promises came and went, like desert winds. Then something shifted. A leader emerged, a former officer named Spendius, a runaway slave from Rome who had nothing left to lose. Another, a Libyan named Mathos, called on local tribes to rise as well. Together, they lit a flame that would burn deeper than any foreign enemy ever had. What began as protest turned into fury. The mercenaries, joined by African allies, surrounded Carthage. They took towns, cut roads, and seized supply lines. The rebellion swelled into a full war, not fought across the sea, but on Carthage's own soil. It was the kind of betrayal that wounds not only armies, but pride. Carthage had created these men. Now, it could not control them. The Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca, who had fought fiercely in Sicily, was summoned again. He knew these warriors, he had led them, and now he had to destroy them. The war was brutal, bitter, and long. No rules of honour remained, executions were public, prisoners were mutilated, entire villages turned to ash. It became known as the Truceless War because no mercy was asked and none was given. Even when the rebellion was crushed, the damage had been done. Carthage had survived, but only barely. The city's strength had turned inward and devoured itself, and while its warriors fought among themselves, another power across the blue horizon had begun to move. Rome's opportunism. Rome watched quietly. It had suffered in the First Punic War, yes, but it had emerged stronger. And while Carthage bled on the rebellion, Rome rebuilt. Its ships patrolled the western sea, its legions trained, waiting. And then, with no announcement, no thunder of war drums, it acted. Sardinia had been a battleground before. It had passed through many hands, Venetians, Etruscans, and now loosely under Carthaginian control. But Carthage, distracted by rebellion and debt, could not guard it well. Local uprisings had already begun on the island. Some towns had declared themselves free. The winds had shifted. And Rome, ever careful, made its move, not with violence, but with presence. In 238 BCE, Roman ships arrived off the coast of Sardinia. There was no battle to mark their coming. The Carthaginian garrisons, underfed and uncertain, withdrew. Some surrendered, others vanished into the forests. Corsica too, small and rocky, soon followed. And just like that, two islands, once part of Carthage's growing trade routes, became Roman provinces. To outsiders, it might have looked like chance, a minor reshuffling of faraway places, but to Carthage it was theft. Sardinia had not been lost in a fair fight. It had been taken while Carthage was still on its knees. Rome had offered no war, no treaty, no warning, only the quiet arrival of soldiers, and the raising of Roman banners where Carthaginian ones once flew. This moment would not be remembered as a victory, it would be remembered as a wound. The cost of honour. Carthage protested. Its leaders demanded the islands be returned. They wrote to the Roman Senate reminding them that there was no formal declaration of war, no battle won. Sardinia, they argued, was not part of the treaty that ended the First Punic War. Rome's seizure of it was not just unjust, it was unspoken war. But Rome did not return Sardinia. Instead, it accused Carthage of preparing for new attacks. It claimed the protests themselves were a threat. And then, with the stroke of a pen, it added insult to injury. It demanded more. Rome issued an ultimatum. If Carthage wanted peace, it would not only surrender the islands officially, but pay another fine, a heavy one. Carthage, still weak from rebellion, had no choice. Its treasury could not fund another war. Its people were exhausted. Its generals, though bitter, saw the trap. To refuse would mean open war. To agree meant accepting humiliation. In silence they paid otta. But the silence was not peace. It was fury buried beneath years of pride. In Carthaginian minds, Rome had broken more than borders. It had broken trust. The rules of engagement, of diplomacy, of empire itself had been twisted. This was not a conflict of armies anymore. It was a conflict of honour. Among those watching was a young man. His name was Hannibal, the son of Hamilcar Barca. He had seen the betrayal. He had heard the Senate's anger. And as legend has it, he stood before his father, placed his hand upon sacred fire, and swore that he would never rest until he had avenged Carthage. The wound was now generational. The wound deepens. Sardinia was not rich in gold or soldiers. It did not hold great temples or legendary cities. It was a rocky island with harsh coasts and narrow roads. But to Carthage it became a symbol of all that had been lost without a fight. Carthage was an empire built on trade, on ships that carried spices, cloth, and stories across the sea. It had risen not only with swords, but with scale and balance. But now that balance had shifted. Sardinia was proof that Carthage could be robbed in plain sight, not by invaders with fire, but by allies with silence. In the years that followed, Carthage turned inward. Its leaders rebuilt the economy, sent merchants eastward, and turned to the rich lands of Iberia, modern-day Spain. But they did so with a shadow in their hearts. The humiliation of Sardinia did not fade. It grew. It whispered in courtrooms and war councils. It hardened the spirit of a city once proud of its diplomacy. And in Rome the senators smiled. Sardinia was just a stepping stone, another piece on a growing board. The war had ended, but the game had not. Rome had learnt that power did not always need to be loud. Sometimes it only needed to wait for a rival to fall. In time, Carthage would rise again, and when it did, it would no longer seek peace. It would seek balance, not through treaties, but through vengeance. And Sardinia, that quiet island, would remain the echo of a silent betrayal. Chapter 7. Born from Fire. Hannibal. The embers of the First Punic War still glowed, even as Carthage turned its gaze westward. In the ashes of Sicily and the humiliation of Sardinia, a new chapter began. Not in the marbled halls of the old city, but in the rugged lands of Iberia. It was here, far from Carthage's wounded heart, that a boy was born into fire. His name was Hannibal, and though he would grow to become the fear of Rome, his story began in silence, as the son of Hamilcar Barca. Hamilcar was no ordinary father. He was a general who had once held the line against Rome, a man who returned home from war with bitterness stitched into his soul. Carthage had lost not through weakness, he believed, but through betrayal and hesitation. And while the city mourned its pride, Hamilcar did not wait. He led Carthage's expansion into Iberia, to reclaim what was taken, to find silver where none yet gleamed, and to raise something stronger than before. Hannibal, born into this new frontier, did not know peace. He was shaped not by lullabies or temple songs, but by the clang of swords and the snort of war horses. His lessons came not from poets, but from warriors, men who had buried friends in Sicilian mud, who taught tactics before tales, discipline before dreams. He learned early that safety was a lie, and that empires could crumble with a signature. To be Hamilcar's son was to carry a burden. It meant learning not only the path of leadership, but the path of vengeance. In the dust of Spain's highlands, in camps bristling with spears, Hannibal listened more than he spoke. He memorized the terrain not just of mountains and rivers, but of resentment, the kind that carved valleys into the soul. His childhood passed beneath the gaze of a father whose silence said more than any command. Remember what they did to us. Never forget. The oath of blood. One moment would shape Hannibal's life forever. A moment wrapped in fire, ritual, and a promise that reached beyond boyhood. As the story goes, Hamilcar brought his son to a sacred altar in their Iberian camp. The flickering flame cast long shadows as warriors stood witness, their armour echoing the heat of the embers. Hamilcar did not kneel. He looked into his son's eyes and asked, "Would you swear to never be a friend to Rome?" The boy did not hesitate. At 9 years old, Hannibal pressed his hand into the fire's warmth, eyes fixed forward. He spoke the words not as a child mimicking adults, but as someone already chosen by fate. The oath was not a game, it was bloodbound, a vow that would define his every breath from that day forward. It was not just about Rome's theft of land, it was about the wound carved into Carthage's soul, a wound that only Hannibal could hope to close. The ritual was over quickly, but its weight remained. From that day, Hannibal was no longer a son in training. He was a flame passed from father to child. His teachers became sharper, his days longer. Latin was added to his studies, not to admire Rome, but to understand it. He learned their stories, their battles, their pride, not out of respect, but to know precisely how to undo them. His mind became a forge. Strategy, endurance, deception, all hammered into him like iron. The oath he took became the foundation of every choice. While other boys dreamed of hunting or sailing, Hannibal studied how empires bled. He knew that the day would come when Carthage would rise again, and when it did, it would need someone who had never forgotten, the Lixon-Han. Iberian stronghold. Carthage had once ruled the seas, but now it turned inland. Iberia, rough, untamed, and rich in silver, became its rebirth. Under Hamilcar's leadership, Carthaginian outposts became cities. One rose taller than the rest. Cart hadashed, New Carthage. It sat on the coast like a jewel, built not just to trade, but to defend and to inspire. Mines fed it, caravans supplied it, and warriors swore to it. Even after Hamilcar's death, the Barca vision did not falter. Hasdrubal the Fair, Hannibal's brother-in-law, took command. He strengthened alliances with local tribes, married into Iberian families, and crafted treaties with a smile rather than a sword. But beneath the surface, the purpose remained unchanged: to restore Carthaginian strength. And when Hasdrubal was assassinated, Hannibal stepped forward. The soldiers did not hesitate. They lifted him on their shields, calling him not just commander, but avenger. He was only 25. From that moment, the land answered to him. Hannibal moved like a shadow, swift, quiet, decisive. He led campaigns deeper into the peninsula, defeating tribes that had never bowed to Carthage. He did not only conquer, he studied. He learned the habits of men, the lay of lands, the timing of seasons, and with every victory silver flowed back into Carthaginian coffers. But silver was not his true prize. It was the silence from Rome, a silence that dared him to test its limits. And then he did. The city of Saguntum lay just south of the Ebro River, which Rome had once declared as the boundary between the two powers. But Rome had formed an alliance with Saguntum, quietly, unofficially. Hannibal saw it as provocation, and so he besieged it. The siege was long and brutal. Hannibal watched it fall stone by stone. Rome protested, sent messengers, called it a breach. But Hannibal had already made up his mind. To him, the war had never ended. It had only paused. And now, it would begin again. The calm before the crossing. Winter crept over the mountains and the world held its breath. Rome had sent envoys to Carthage, demanding justice, demanding that Hannibal be turned over. But the Carthaginian council stood firm. They would not betray the man who had given them strength. Diplomacy dissolved into silence, and in that silence Hannibal moved. He did not wait for formal war. He gathered his army, a blend of Iberian foot soldiers, Numidian cavalry, and African war elephants. These were not scattered raiders. These were men shaped by survival, veterans of mountain passes and highland ambushes, fighters who trusted only one thing: the man who led them. Hannibal stood before them, not with grand speeches, but with quiet certainty. He pointed north, toward the Alps. Most had never seen them. Those who had spoke of their height, their snow, their death, but Hannibal did not waver. He marched. Across the Ebro, through Gaul, through rivers and forests. His army moved like a whisper against the wind. Local tribes resisted, and still he pressed forward. The farther they climbed, the harder the journey became. Cold bit at their hands, ice stole their footing, but still they marched. One step at a time, they crossed into history. The Alps were not just mountains, they were memory. Every stone whispered that this could not be done, and yet Hannibal's men followed him. When at last they descended into the plains of northern Italy, they were fewer, frostbitten, weary, but alive, and ahead of them Rome waited. unaware that the ground beneath them had already begun to shake. It was the calm before the storm.
But for Hannibal, it was only the beginning. Chapter 8. The Mountains Remember.
High in the stillness of ancient mountains, where clouds drift like whispers and snow falls without end, the impossible began. Hannibal Barca stood at the foot of the Alps, not with poems or prayers, but with an army shaped by silence and oath. Behind him lay Iberia, battered roads and broken treaties. Before him rose a wall of stone, white and cold, older than memory. Few had ever dared to cross it. Fewer still had survived. The journey began slow, paths twisted through frozen forest, winds howled with voices that sounded like ghosts. The soldiers, wrapped in leather and resolve, marched step by step, trusting not the land but the man who led them. These were not Roman roads. These were trails carved by animals and avalanches. One misstep meant death, one rockfall could end hundreds. Snow fell not gently but in sheets that swallowed the world. The sun was hidden, time bent. Day and night became the same pale blur. Men lost their footing. Mules slipped and vanished into the white void. Provisions froze solid. Boots tore. The men wrapped themselves in furs soaked with meltwater and pressed on. For many, there were no more songs, no more stories, only breathing, only survival. But something deeper held them together, a shared anger, a common wound. They were not just marching to war. They were rising out of shame, up from the ashes of defeat. They were led by a man who carried not just a sword, but a purpose. Hannibal said little, but he was always there, walking with the men, sleeping on frozen stone, his eyes fixed on the heights ahead. Each step they took was not just upward, it was into legend. Elephants in the ice. Among the strange sights the Alps had ever seen, none was stranger than the elephants. Beasts from warm lands, broad and mighty, now stood trembling in mountain winds. Their thick hides were no match for the icy air, their feet cracked against stone, their trunks curled from frost, and yet they marched, Stroth. These animals had been brought not just for war, but for wonder. They were symbols of power, of fear. Romans had never fought such creatures on their soil. Hannibal knew this. He knew the power of myth. But now, the beasts were vulnerable. Where once they had moved through the dust of Africa or the sunlit hills of Iberia, now they stepped cautiously over narrow trails of ice, inches from death. Mean helpers coaxed them with fire and food, though both were scarce. Fires barely lasted in the wind. Food was rationed by the mouthful. Still, the elephants pressed on, not out of loyalty, but because there was no turning back. They were too large to retreat, too proud to fall without trying. Some did not make it, slipping, sliding, crashing into ravines that swallowed them whole. Their cries echoed through the valleys like distant thunder. Each loss sent ripples of sorrow through the ranks, not just because they were useful, but because they had become companions in the suffering. But those that survived did so with quiet bravery. When the army paused to rest, the elephants stood like statues, steam rising from their flanks, eyes half closed against the cold. Their presence was a reminder that if even these creatures could endure, so too could men. By the time they reached the higher passes, the elephants were no longer just animals. They were symbols of what this journey meant. Pain endured for a cause greater than survival. Tribes and treachery. The mountains were not empty. Hidden among the slopes were tribes, fierce, sharp-eyed, and unkind to strangers. These were people of the cliffs, people of the stone. They knew every pass, every choke point, every path that seemed safe but ended in death, and they watched the foreign army climb higher, like ants dragging fire behind them. At first, the locals greeted Hannibal with feigned friendship. They offered guides, they offered food. But in the night, weapons vanished, supplies were stolen, paths became traps, rocks fell from above. What began as welcome became warning, then ambush. Hannibal knew betrayal when he saw it. He had grown up in the ruins of diplomacy. He responded with patience, not panic. His scouts spread out, guards were doubled, fires were lit close to the cliffs so no one could creep in the dark. Still, attacks came, small, quick raids, arrows from behind trees, spears from above, screams in the dark. Every mile was a battle. Every pass was stained with blood. Men fell not from wounds, but from exhaustion. Some chose not to rise in the morning. Their bodies were buried under snow, marked by broken shields or stones piled by friends. There were no grand ceremonies, only silence, the kind that settles after the wind stops. Peace, but even as they lost men, they did not lose heart. Hannibal's calm was a shield stronger than iron. His gaze never wavered. In every moment of chaos he appeared, riding at the front, sword raised, reminding them with each charge that this pain had meaning. They were not just crossing a mountain, they were crossing into history. ... When the worst of the ambushes passed, Hannibal gathered what remained. Though smaller now, the army had become steel, thinned, hardened, sharp. They had faced not just the enemy, but the mountain itself, and they had not turned back. The descent to Italy. At last, the wind began to change. The peaks no longer rose above them. Now they fell behind. A view opened up before the army, vast and green. The valleys of northern Italy stretched out like a waiting hand. The snows faded, the skies lightened. The Great Wall had been crossed. They had marched for over 2 weeks through terrain most armies would not dare to enter. From thousands, fewer than half remained. Many wounded, many ill, but alive. And ahead of them, Rome. Not yet touched, not yet warned. The descent was not without struggle. Slopes remained steep, trails still narrow, but compared to the ascent it felt like release. Soldiers who had not smiled in days let their shoulders drop. They spoke again of families, of food, of the battles to come. They were not broken, they were reborn. The elephants, though fewer, walked with greater ease now. Each step forward made them stronger. Below, rivers glittered in the sunlight. Farmlands dotted the horizon. Roads curled towards unknown towns. Rome had not expected war to arrive from this direction, and Hannibal had made sure of that. When they reached the lowlands, the locals stared in awe. Never had they seen an army like this, beasts from the south, warriors wrapped in furs, eyes that burned with something deeper than revenge, purpose. And Hannibal, standing before them, did not claim victory. Not yet. He had not come to conquer land. He had come to remind the world that Carthage was not finished. He had crossed the Alps not to surprise Rome, but to haunt it. From that moment, Rome would never sleep as soundly again. Chapter 9. The Butcher's Field, Cannae. It was the summer of 216 BCE, and the fields of Cannae lay still under the weight of the Apulian sun. The grain had already been harvested, but the land remained golden, wide and open. A gentle wind drifted through the grass, making the earth seem peaceful, quiet, almost sacred. But something ancient stirred in the soil. Beneath that calm lay tension, coiled and waiting. Rome had been hurt, deeply, first at the Trebia, then more sharply at Lake Trasimene. Hannibal had brought war into Italy's very chest, and Rome's pride bled with every defeat. But Rome was not a city that surrendered. After 2 years of stinging humiliation, the Senate gathered its strength in one great act of defiance. An army like none Rome had ever raised was brought into being, an overwhelming host of infantry, cavalry, allies and citizens, numbering more than 80,000 men. Command was given not to one, but 2 consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. The former, cautious and deliberate, the latter, bold and restless. Each man would take turns commanding the army on alternating days, a compromise that masked a dangerous disunity. Hannibal, meanwhile, had chosen his ground. He moved to the plains of Cannae deliberately. Here, the land was open, perfect for cavalry maneuvers. The wind often blew from behind him toward the enemy's eyes. The heat could be oppressive, especially for soldiers in tight formations. He had studied the Roman mind and knew their arrogance, and so he waited. Not with fear, but with silent confidence. For days, the 2 armies camped across from each other. Paulus hesitated. Varro fumed. The Romans wanted revenge. They wanted to erase the shame of their past defeats. And finally, on the day when Varro held command, the choice was made. Battle. No more waiting, no more hesitation. The Roman host moved into formation, unaware that every step forward was already part of Hannibal's design. The battle begins. Dawn broke red over the fields. The early mist clung low to the earth, glowing under the rising sun. Roman soldiers readied their weapons with the clink of metal, the leather of straps and the creaking of wooden shields. A stillness held the camp, broken only by the steady breath of tens of thousands waiting for the signal. The Romans advanced in a deep, narrow column. It was a formation meant to punch through the enemy's centre with brute force. Behind rows of legionaries, more waited, shoulder to shoulder, packed tight. They were confident. How could they not be? They outnumbered Hannibal nearly 2-1. Before them stood an enemy whose centre appeared weak. Gauls and Spaniards were placed in a crescent-shaped front line slightly curved outward. But Hannibal had placed them there with care. These troops were not meant to hold. They were bait. Behind them, hidden and waiting, were his best African infantry. On the far wings stood Hannibal's cavalry, led by the Numidian horsemen, light, fast and deadly. As the Romans pressed forward, the dust began to rise. The clatter of armour grew louder. The centre of Hannibal's line began to bend, pulling back with every step the Romans took. The crescent bowed inward, drawing them in deeper and deeper into the trap. The Romans believed they were winning. They shouted, drove forward harder, felt the enemy giving way. But Hannibal saw it all from his position, saw the formation taking shape, saw the eagerness of the enemy, saw the jaws of the trap begin to close. Then, with a single signal, the real battle began. Death in every direction. The first strike came from the wings. Hannibal's cavalry had routed the Roman horsemen on both flanks. The Numidians and the heavy Spanish horsemen circled behind the Roman rear. The hammer blow fell. At the same time, the African infantry on the wings began to pivot inward. They didn't charge in desperation, they didn't scream or run, they turned with discipline and pressed in on both sides. What had been a wide field of battle began to shrink. The Romans, deep in the enemy's centre, suddenly found themselves surrounded. The crescent that had pulled them in now curved behind them. From the front, the retreating Gauls and Spaniards halted and fought with renewed strength. From both sides the African elite closed in, and from behind the cavalry stormed into the rear. There was no space to turn, no space to lift a sword. Shields pressed against backs, bodies against bodies. The heat, already brutal, became suffocating. The dust filled lungs. The stench of sweat and fear and blood hung thick. The slaughter was not fast. It was slow, terrifying and methodical. The Romans tried to fight, but they could not move. Sword arms could not rise. Many died without ever striking a blow. Some suffocated, crushed by the weight of those around them. Others died standing, unable to fall. The sun climbed higher. The dust darkened with blood. The screams of dying men, once loud, gave way to groans, to gasps, to silence. By nightfall it was over. Nearly 50,000 Romans lay dead. Some say it was more. Some say the earth drank so deeply that day no one could count the cost. It was not a battle, it was an execution, and still, in that awful silence, Rome's shadow lingered, not broken, not bowed. Not yet. Rome does not fall. News of the defeat took time to reach the city. Messengers arrived days later, breathless, bleeding, broken. The first reports were dismissed as exaggeration, but the truth could not be hidden. Consuls dead, senators fallen, entire legions erased from the earth. The city froze. Families gathered in silence, mothers waited at gates, the Senate met in fear. But what followed was not chaos. Rome did not panic, Rome did not surrender. Rome, wounded and bleeding, stood up. There was no open weeping. Public mourning was banned. The people were told to carry on, to endure, to rebuild. The Senate met in full session. They heard the facts, the scale of the disaster, and they chose not despair but defiance. Allies were sent envoys, supplies were ordered, training resumed, boys were enlisted, every able man was summoned. The city's fire, once dimmed, began to glow again. In the heart of the city, a 17-year-old boy named Scipio vowed never to forget Cannae. He was not yet the general he would become, but even now the spark of destiny stirred. Rome's future was already forming, quietly, patiently, like a seed beneath ashes. And Hannibal? Victorious, yes. But he did not march on Rome, he did not break the Republic. He waited for allies to rise, for the Italian cities to abandon their master. But they did not. Some defected, most did not. Rome's heart held. In the end, the Battle of Cannae was not the death of Rome, it was the beginning of its transformation. The pain of that day would never fade, but neither would its resolve. The fields of Cannae still stretch wide today. The wind still moves through golden grass. But if you listen closely, you might still hear echoes of shields breaking, of horses screaming, of a city that nearly fell, but didn't. Chapter 10. The Shadow General, Fabius Maximus. The fields of Italy had burned before, but never like this. Now the smoke did not rise from the wrath of Hannibal alone. Rome the mighty had learned a strange and quiet lesson. As the dust of the Second Punic War settled into its second year, Rome did not respond with thunder. It responded with silence. It did not charge. It waited. When Fabius Maximus took command, there was no grand declaration, no fiery speech, just a man of steady voice and weary eyes stepping into history's shadow. The Senate, desperate after so many losses, gave him extraordinary powers. He was made dictator, not a tyrant, but a guardian of order. And with that power, he did what no Roman had dared. He chose not to fight. The enemy marched, burned and looted, and Fabius watched. His soldiers grew restless, hungry for battle, but he made no move. Instead, he followed Hannibal, always from a distance. When Hannibal crossed the hills, Fabius shadowed his path. When he camped in a valley, Fabius camped above. When he turned toward the coast, the Romans turned too, never striking, never leaving. This was a new kind of war. One fought not with swords, but with time. Fabius scorched the fields ahead of Hannibal, denying him food. He ordered the peasants to flee to the cities, carrying everything of value. Wells were poisoned, supplies hidden, roads destroyed. Hannibal's army, far from Carthage and deeper into enemy land, began to feel the hunger, not for victory, but for bread, for rest, for safety. The Carthaginian commander, brilliant as he was, began to fume. Hannibal wanted a decisive battle, but the battlefield never came. His soldiers grumbled, his horses weakened. He looked into the Italian hills and saw no enemy, only the dust rising behind him. Fabius was not trying to win, he was trying to wait. And in this quiet waiting, in this unseen war, the seeds of Rome's future were sown. The mockery of Rome. But Rome did not understand. The city had known heroes with burning swords, generals who charged, who bled, who fell with honour. But this hiding, this patience, felt like shame. The people of Rome watched from afar as Hannibal moved freely across their land. Towns fell, farms burned, and Fabius, their chosen leader, did nothing. They mocked him in the streets, they called him Conctator, the Delayer. Meant as an insult, the name followed him like a whisper through marble halls and crowded markets. Some said he was a coward, others accused him of betrayal, even of secret dealings with Hannibal. Senators grumbled behind his back, even his own officers questioned his orders. He did not answer them, but he walked the forum in silence. He visited the temples. He prayed not for glory, but for endurance. And when young commanders grew bold, pressing him to strike, he shook his head with that same quiet force that had become his armour. The pressure built, and in time, the Senate took part of his power away. A second commander was added beside him, Minucius, hot-blooded, proud, a man of action. And Minucius would soon charge ahead, seeking the kind of fame that Rome adored. In the fields of Apulia, Minucius engaged Hannibal's forces. He thought he had found weakness, but Hannibal, ever the tactician, had lured him into a trap. Surrounded, the Roman forces began to fall, until, through the smoke, Fabius came. He'd watched from the hills, and when the trap was sprung, he moved, not with haste, but with precision. His arrival saved the Roman army, not by daring, but by discipline. After that day, Minucius stepped back. The men called Fabius their shield. Rome still grumbled, but less loudly now. They began to see something strange in his stillness. Not fear, but strength. For in a world that honoured the sword, it takes greater courage to sheathe it. Fire in the night. There came a night when the stars burned low and the fires of war danced on the edges of a narrow valley. Hannibal had camped within, his troops nestled between hills, unaware that Rome had set a trap. Fabius had waited for weeks. He had followed the Carthaginians across rugged land, always keeping his army on high ground. And now, with the advantages the Roman officers whispered of victory, they could surround the valley, starve them, strike by dawn. But Fabius said no. The officers protested. They begged. But he held firm. The trap would stay closed, but not sprung. He ordered his soldiers to hold position, to remain hidden. And in the quiet of the night, something unexpected happened. Hannibal escaped to me. He lit hundreds of torches and tied them to the horns of cattle. In the darkness, the moving lights mimicked a retreating army. The Romans panicked. Thinking the Carthaginians were fleeing up the hillside, they broke formation and gave chase, but it was a trick. While the cattle wandered in confusion, Hannibal's forces slipped away through another pass. Rome had missed its chance. And the critics returned. They howled louder than before. They said Fabius had let the wolf escape the cage, that he had handed Hannibal the war. Fabius once again remained still. What they didn't see was this. The escape had cost Hannibal dearly. His troops, already tired, had no rest. His supplies ran thinner by the hour. The long war he hoped to avoid had now become reality. With each passing month his men grew weaker. With each burned field his strength faded. Fabius had not failed. He had forced the enemy to bleed without a sword being drawn. Fire in the night had not marked Rome's shame. It had marked the turning of the tide. The strength of holding back. Seasons changed. The sun rose and fell on hills that had seen too much war. The rivers ran slower. The roads were quieter. The land scarred by fire and fear began to breathe again. And still, Fabius held back. There would come other generals, younger ones, bolder ones, but none would match his patience. In time, Rome would rise to strike, not with rage, but with purpose. It would build new legions, stronger armies, better strategies. But the root of that strength was here, in the quiet resistance of Fabius Maximus. His strategy was not about defeating Hannibal in a single blow. It was about surviving him. It was about dragging time behind Roman shields until the enemy was too tired to stand. It was about teaching Rome a lesson deeper than pride, that sometimes the strongest hand is the one that does not reach for the sword. History would remember many great warriors, but among them Fabius stood apart. He had not won battles, but he had saved a nation. And though the people of Rome took time to understand, they would come to honour him not just as the delayer, but as the one who turned fear into patience, chaos into calm, and waiting into victory. In the end, Fabius Maximus did not shout, did not charge, did not burn with glory. He watched, he waited, and by doing so, he changed the war. Chapter 11. Scipio Rises. The name Scipio would one day echo through the marble halls of Roman memory, but before it stood tall in triumph, it stood alone in sorrow. Publius Cornelius Scipio was barely 17 when the dust of Cannae filled his lungs. He had not yet commanded legions, but he had seen the heart of war. The blood of his comrades ran into the dirt that day. Rome's might had shattered. His father, the elder Scipio, survived the battle, but fell soon after in a separate campaign, as did his uncle. One by one, those who shaped young Publius's world were taken, but unlike many, he did not collapse into despair. Even in grief, something stirred within him. He walked through the broken camps, past the tents that would never again be filled, and made a quiet vow. Scipio was not just a soldier, he was a thinker. He remembered the patterns of Hannibal's attacks, the rhythm of ambush and lure. Where others saw only confusion, Scipio saw method. The boy who had survived Rome's darkest hour was learning from the very man who had brought it. He did not deny fear, but he did not surrender to it either. Rome noticed. The Senate watched him closely. His courage, his calm, his gift for listening, all pointed to a leader not in title but in spirit. And soon, the Republic needed someone like him. Not to hold the line, but to draw a new one. A younger generation, moulded by disaster, was ready to rise. At its centre stood Scipio, the boy who had not broken.
Spain's reversal.
While Hannibal still roamed Italy's hills and valleys, the Romans looked to the west, to Iberia, the land of Spain. This was not just a distant province, it was Carthage's beating heart. Its silver mines fueled their war, its warriors filled Hannibal's ranks. If Rome could strike there, it could pull the war's root from the soil. But Iberia was dangerous. Rome had already lost generals there. The Scipio brothers, father and uncle of young Publius, had both died in its forests and plains. Sending someone new required more than bravery, it required brilliance.
Scipio, barely in his mid-20s, volunteered. There was hesitation, of course. He was young, untried. But Rome had little left to lose, and in him they saw something fierce, yet clear. The command was his. When he arrived in Spain, he did not come with blunt force. He came with a plan. Hannibal was far away in Italy, and Carthage had grown comfortable in Iberia. Scipio moved quickly. He targeted the city of New Carthage, a stronghold thought to be safe behind walls and marshes. In a bold, almost unbelievable strike, he took it. He crossed the marshes when the tides were lowest, catching the defenders off guard. In a single day, the heart of Carthaginian Spain fell, not just a city, a symbol. From there, his influence spread. He treated the locals with respect, won over allies, and slowly turned Carthage's rear into Rome's front. It wasn't just about battles, it was about turning the board. Hannibal still stood in Italy, but his strength was now bleeding in the west, the diplomacy of war. Scipio's victories did not rest only on the edge of his sword. He understood that war was more than just fighting. It was about minds, about hearts, about trust, and so he listened, to tribal leaders, to weary generals, to captured enemies. He spoke calmly, offered fair terms, and made promises that he intended to keep. He met with princes and chieftains not as a conqueror, but as a man who understood what they stood to lose. In a time when most Roman leaders ruled with fear, Scipio inspired with clarity. Even enemies began to reconsider. Some who had marched with Carthage now opened their gates to Rome. In one case, entire villages changed sides without a single sword drawn. He understood the weight of mercy. When he spared families, when he honoured treaties, he sowed the seeds of loyalty. This was a different kind of war. Quieter, slower, but perhaps more permanent. Scipio was not just dismantling Carthage's forces, he was replacing them with something stronger. Trust. In a new order. In these years he began to show the full shape of his mind. He studied not only strategy but psychology. He asked not just how to win, but why people followed. For Scipio, each village turned was a victory, each ally gained was a wall raised between Rome and future danger. He could fight, yes, and when he did, he was swift and ruthless. But he never forgot that the greatest battle was the one never fought. His victories were maps redrawn without blood. The road to Africa. By the time Scipio returned to Rome, the people knew his name. They had heard of his courage, his genius, his conquests in Spain. But more than that, they felt hope again. After years of sorrow, a new sun was rising over the Republic. Scipio was still young, yet already he spoke like someone who had lived 2 lifetimes, one in loss and one in purpose. The Senate listened to him with care. He did not demand power, but he did ask for one thing: the chance to bring the war to Africa. It was a daring request. To cross the sea, to strike the city of Carthage itself, it had never been done. Many senators hesitated. The wounds of Cannae had not fully healed. Hannibal was still in Italy. But Scipio argued with calm reason. He said that Hannibal could not be defeated in Italy. The key was to pull him home. And so, after long debate, permission was granted. Scipio was given command. He began preparing his forces. He trained them carefully. He taught them to move fast, to think, to adapt. These were not just legions, they were instruments of a new kind of warfare.
As the ships were prepared and the sails made ready, an old whisper from prophecy returned to Rome. Long ago, it was said that when a Roman army landed in Africa, only one commander would return, the others would fall.
The meaning of the prophecy was unclear. Was it a warning? A test? Some said it meant doom. Others said it meant destiny. But Scipio did not flinch. He had seen death and chosen life. He had walked through fire and emerged calm. And now, as he looked across the sea, he knew that the final act of the war was near. The path ahead would not be easy, but it would be his. The survivor of Cannae had become Rome's sword, and that sword was now pointed at the heart of Carthage. Chapter 12. The End of Hannibal. The sun had long since set on Hannibal's brightest hour. For years he had danced across Italy like a storm, swift, unpredictable and feared. But time, like the most patient enemy, had worn away the strength that even Hannibal could not protect. His soldiers had thinned, his supplies had run dry, and Rome, through years of pain and learning, had changed. Far from the burning fields of Italy, in the heart of Carthage, a desperate call was made. The Senate sent word across the sea: Hannibal was to return. It was not a triumphant recall, it was a summoning, a call for salvation. Carthage had stood too long in the shadow of defeat. Rome was no longer chasing Hannibal through its own lands, it was now marching toward Carthage itself. The man who had left as a rising flame now returned as a burdened soul. He had been undefeated in mind, but not in outcome. Victory had always felt just one battle away, and yet it had never truly come. Now he walked among his people, no longer the myth, but the man, and still they believed in him. He began to gather what he could. Soldiers were raised from young boys and aging men. Veterans from older wars were called back into service. Weapons were rushed to the forges. Elephants, the monstrous symbols of Carthaginian might, were prepared once again. But the Carthage Hannibal returned to was not the one that had sent him off in his youth. It was a city that had tasted fear, that had grown cautious and brittle under Rome's pressure. Across the sea, Scipio Africanus, Rome's rising star, was already in Africa. He had brought the war home, forcing Carthage to face what it had long inflicted. Scipio's armies moved with discipline and strength, bolstered by allies, hardened by the fires of Spain, and guided by patience Rome had once lacked. Now, the war that had stretched across decades and continents was folding into its final page. Two generals, once separated by sea and fate, would finally stand across from each other. Not as strangers, but as equals. The campfire meeting. Before the dawn could rise over the plains of Zama, two shadows moved in silence toward a single fire. Scipio and Hannibal, the young lion and the seasoned wolf, came together not with drawn swords, but with measured words. It was an old tradition, meeting before battle, not to taunt, not to plead, but to see the measure of the soul they were about to face. In the flicker of firelight they sat, not as enemies, but as men who had carried the weight of nations on their backs. Scipio had studied Hannibal for years. He had shaped his tactics by watching the master. He had won not by copying, but by understanding, and Hannibal, in turn, had heard of this Roman's rise. He had listened to the tales of Cannae's survivor-turned-conqueror. Their conversation was not recorded in detail, but the echoes remain. Some say Hannibal offered terms, others say he warned of the cost. But whatever was said, it was not anger that filled the night air, it was respect. These were not men eager to kill, they were men who knew what killing meant. They spoke as if time had stopped, as if the war for just one breath had paused to let history look back on itself. One had begun this war as a boy, the other would end it as a man. Both knew that, come morning, only one world would remain. And when they rose from the fire, no hatred passed between them, only silence and the long shadows of what could not be undone. The Battle of Zama. The plain of Zama was open, flat and dry. No valleys to trap, no forests to hide. It was not a place for tricks. It was a place for courage. Both armies stood in lines as the sun crept above the horizon. Dust lifted with every step. Shields glinted. Banners snapped in the breeze. Hannibal placed his elephants at the front,
nearly 80 of them, tall and armoured, their tusks sharpened and their eyes wide with fear. Behind them he arranged mercenaries, then Carthaginian citizens, and finally his veterans, the hardened core who had followed him from the very start. Scipio, prepared and calm, had seen the danger of elephants before. He opened corridors in his lines, spaces between Roman ranks wide enough to let the beasts pass through rather than crush them. Trumpets sounded, the elephants charged. But the Roman front did not falter. Horns blared, loud sharp noises pierced the morning air, javelins flew. The elephants panicked. Some turned back, crashing into Hannibal's own lines. Chaos swirled at the front, but the Roman soldiers stood firm. Then came the infantry. Hannibal's mercenaries surged forward, fierce and wild. They clashed with Rome's disciplined legions. Blood soaked the dust. Screams joined the roar of war. But the mercenaries soon fell back, and the citizens took their place, fighting not with skill, but with desperation. Still, the Roman line held. And then Hannibal unleashed his final strength. The veterans stepped forward. These were not fresh recruits, these were the survivors of dozens of battles, men who had marched from the Alps to the heart of Italy. They moved as one, calm and brutal. For a moment it seemed as though time bent. The Roman line wavered, a ruptoria. Scipio responded with precision. He pulled troops from the rear, stretched his line wider, and enveloped the attack. Cavalry, led by his ally Massinissa, returned just in time, crashing into the Carthaginian rear. Hannibal's army, once a wall of power, began to bend, then break. At Zama, there were no tricks, no traps, only the weight of preparation, the discipline of Rome, and the exhaustion of a war that had gone too long. The Carthaginian veterans, valiant to the end, could not hold forever. By sunset, the battle was over. Carthage had lost, and Hannibal, the warrior who had never truly been defeated in mind or will, now stood in the dust of finality. A legend walks away. There are defeats, and there are endings. Zama was both. Rome did not kill Hannibal. It could not. His name had become too vast, too deeply etched into the memory of war. Instead, he walked away, not as a prisoner, not as a traitor, but as a man left behind by the world he once shaped. Carthage would sign peace. A bitter one. It lost its empire, its fleet, its pride. Rome became the master of the Western world, and Scipio Africanus was given his name, not just Scipio, but the African, conqueror of Carthage. But even in defeat, Hannibal remained a shadow in the minds of his enemies. He would continue to live, moving from city to city, advising kings, fleeing Roman agents. For years he stayed one step ahead of capture, still playing the game of strategy long after his battlefield had vanished. Carthage, however, would never recover. Its heart had been broken, its ambitions buried beneath treaties and taxes. The city that once dared to challenge Rome now bowed its head in silence. And through it all, Hannibal carried the weight, not just of failure, but of something deeper. The realization that brilliance, even unmatched brilliance, is not always enough. That one man, no matter how gifted, cannot hold an empire together with will alone. He had led elephants across mountains, he had shattered Roman legions, he had walked through history as if fate bowed to him. But in the end, Hannibal walked away, alone. The war was over, and with it the last breath of Carthage faded into memory, not with a scream, but with the quiet footsteps of the man who had dared to challenge the world. Chapter 13. The Years of Quiet Hate. The smoke had cleared, but the memory of ruin clung to the stones like ash. Carthage had been broken, not just in battle, but in spirit, her pride dragged through the dust of surrender. After the Second Punic War, the treaty was harsh. Her fleet was gone, her armies disbanded. Heavy war debts weighed down her shoulders. The great harbour, once filled with merchant sails and soldier galleys, now lay mostly quiet. And yet, a strange thing began to stir in the silence. It was not rebellion, it was not rage, it was something quieter, resolve. Brick by brick, Carthage began to rise again. The people returned to their markets, farmers worked the fields beyond the city's walls, the soft clang of hammers replaced the scream of war. Carthaginian merchants once more ventured across the sea, carrying fine cloth, glassware and grain. The city, long known for trade, leaned into her gift for commerce. Though forbidden from raising an army, Carthage built her wealth anew, this time not with swords but with scales and contracts. She paid her debts to Rome, every silver coin a reminder of both humiliation and discipline. Her harbours grew busy again. The purple dyes, the olive oil, the pottery, they flowed from Carthage like blood once did, except now it nourished, not destroyed. The people of Carthage knew they could not fight, but they could still live, and in this life there was quiet power. The very city Rome had crushed was becoming, once more, a glowing light in Africa. But across the sea, in the heart of Rome, this light was not welcomed. It was watched. It was feared. To many Romans, Carthage was supposed to stay broken. She was meant to be a warning, not a rival. Yet the Mediterranean winds carried news that trade was booming, the fields were fertile, and the coin boxes of Carthaginian merchants were full once more. Rome had won the war, but now they watched a defeated city begin to thrive in peace. And peace, to some, began to feel like a mistake. Cato the Elder. Among the senators of Rome, few spoke with more fire than Marcus Porcius Cato, a man of age, of discipline, and of a deep, bone-set hatred for Carthage. He had fought in the past war, and though it had ended long ago, he never truly left the battlefield. Cato walked the halls of the Senate like a ghost of Rome's older, harder days. He wore his years like armour, his words like blades, and every time he stood to speak, no matter the subject, no matter the law or topic of debate, he ended his speeches with the same cold phrase: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. It was not shouted, it was not argued, it was delivered like a whisper that rusted in the ears of those who heard it. It was a reminder, repeated again and again, like the ticking of a clock that only counted down to war. Cato believed Carthage was dangerous simply because it existed. Prosperity was its crime, trade its weapon, and peace? Peace was merely a breath between two battles. To younger senators, it may have seemed excessive, but to many, Cato's voice carried the weight of Rome's past. He was the echo of the old republic, a time when Rome took what it wanted, feared no rival, and believed that safety only came through strength. So when he lifted a fresh fig in the Senate and told his fellow men that it had been picked just days ago in Carthage, the message was clear. They are not far, they are not weak, and they are not finished. Each time Cato uttered his now famous words, they stuck like burrs to the robes of Rome's lawmakers. The world was changing. But old hates are heavy things. They do not soften easily, and in the silent spaces between speeches, between votes and campaigns, Cato's words sank deeper, feeding a storm no one yet dared name. Hannibal's last flight. Far from the marketplaces of Carthage, and farther still from the marble halls of Rome, one man lived like a hunted shadow, a ghost in armour, known across empires by a single name: Hannibal. He had once marched elephants across the Alps, once broken Rome's armies at Cannae, but now he was a fugitive, a man with no home, no army, no peace. Rome wanted him captured. Carthage, under Rome's watch, could no longer protect him, and so Hannibal became a wanderer. He found refuge where he could, among eastern kings, in foreign courts, in the deep shadows of distant cities. Some welcomed him, curious of the mind that had once shaken Rome. Others feared him, not wanting to draw the wrath of the Republic. Hannibal offered his brilliance to any who would have him, not as a conqueror, but as an advisor. Even in exile, his mind was sharp, but he was always looking over his shoulder. The Romans followed him like wolves, never forgetting the man who had once brought them to the edge of collapse. For years they searched, sending envoys, applying pressure, hunting not for battle, but for silence. They wanted Hannibal gone, not in chains, not in court, but gone from the story entirely. Eventually Rome's pressure reached even the far corners of the world. Hannibal, knowing the trap was closing, made a final decision. He would not let Rome have him. He would not stand in chains. Alone in a foreign land, he took poison, ending the chase forever. It is said his last words were simple: Let us relieve the Romans of their fear." And with that, Hannibal, Carthage's greatest son, disappeared from the world, leaving behind no city, no grave, only memory. But memory is a strange kind of seed. Even when the man was gone, his story lived on, whispered in every Roman camp and Carthaginian tavern. He had been the storm, and though the sky was now still, the world remembered the thunder. The inevitable flame. Years passed. Carthage, bound by treaty, never raised a sword. She traded, she planted, she paid, and she waited. In Rome, some claimed she was obeying. Others whispered she was only pretending. There was no army in Carthage, but there were walls, wealth and will. And in Rome's heart, that was enough to light fear into flame. The debts were repaid, every last coin delivered. Carthage had kept her side of the peace. But peace, as Rome saw it, was not the absence of war. It was the submission of rivals. And Carthage, alive and thriving, was a rival still. Then came a moment. A spark. A conflict with a local tribe, Numidia, brought Carthage into defence. They fought back, protecting their land. But in doing so, they had broken the treaty. Not in bloodshed, but in principle. Rome had found its reason. It was small, it was simple, but it was enough. Senators leaned forward. Cato's old words stirred again. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. This time the phrase was not a whisper. It was a plan. Rome began to prepare. Legions were trained, supplies gathered, envoys sent with impossible demands. They told Carthage to abandon her walls, to disarm, to die before the battle even began. Carthage, stunned and betrayed, refused. She had no army, but she had pride. No weapons, but she had fire. The Third Punic War was not a surprise. It was the closing act of a hatred that had never truly ended. A final breath held for too long. Rome had waited, watched, and whispered. Now it moved, and as the ships crossed the sea toward the city they had once crushed, it was not war they carried. It was a sentence. Carthage, proud and reborn, would burn again. But this time, it would be final. The years of quiet hate were ending, and in their place, fire would rise. Chapter 14, The Final Siege. The ships came first, sleek Roman vessels slipping across the sea like knives drawn in silence. Behind them the legions followed, their shields glinting beneath the North African sun. At their head rode a man young in years but heavy with history, Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption to the great Scipio Africanus, who had once shattered Hannibal's dream. Now it would be this Scipio's turn to end what the first had begun. Rome had returned, and this time it had no intention of leaving Carthage standing. The Senate had issued a final demand. It was not a request, not a negotiation. It was a sentence. Carthage was to be abandoned. Her people were to leave the coast, destroy their own city, and rebuild far inland, away from the sea, away from ships, from trade, from life itself. The message was cruelly clear. Carthage must stop being Carthage. Her heart, her harbour, her identity, all were to be erased. But Carthage, though weary, still breathed. And even breath can become fire when backed against a wall. The city's leaders met and listened. Some wept, some begged for compromise, but in the end something deeper than fear spoke. Pride, memory, blood. Carthage would not go quietly into the sand. If she were to vanish, it would be with flames rising, not with hands folded in surrender. So they refused. No inland exile, no self-destruction. The people would stay. They would fight, not because they believed they could win, but because dying with dignity was the last gift they could offer to the land that raised them. And with that decision, the final war truly began. Scipio tightened the noose. His army encircled the city, cutting off supply routes. Carthage, once the master of sea and trade, was now alone, a jewel sealed in stone, waiting for the hammer. The walls hold. The siege stretched long, measured not in days or weeks, but in hunger and silence.
Roman camps surrounded Carthage like roots around a dying tree. Nothing got in, nothing got out. But still the city stood. The outer walls, thick and high, refused to fall. Inside, the people braced themselves for the slow storm that crept ever closer. The famine came first. Granaries emptied, wraps and weeds became meals. Children cried in voices that grew thinner by the day. Then came the sickness. With no food, no medicine, and nowhere to run, disease found its home among the desperate. Streets that once rang with the sounds of merchants and markets now echoed with coughs and prayers. But in this suffering, a strange kind of strength began to grow. Carthaginians who had never held a sword now fashioned weapons from scrap and stone. Women tore linen into slings, priests blessed boiling oil, old men too weak to fight carried water to the young. The city, once known for gold and trade, had become a house of resistance. The walls were not just stone, they were spirit. 3 layers deep, reinforced with watchtowers and inner corridors, they held fast against Roman siege machines. Day after day, battering rams struck, and still the gates did not open. Night after night, fire arrows rained, and still the towers stood. Inside, Carthage bled, but she bled with defiance. Her people whispered ancient prayers passed down from their ancestors. They called upon Baal, upon Tanit, upon Eshmun, the healing god. They begged for deliverance, but the sky remained quiet. Scipio watched with a mix of frustration and respect. This was no easy victory. He had come to end a city, not to crush insects. And what he faced now was not an enemy of strength, but of sheer burning will. The breach. Time wore on, and Scipio changed his tactics. He tightened the siege further, building great earthworks and siege towers, choking Carthage from every side. Then came the final blow, a breach. Not through the front gates, not through open war, but through the sea wall, long thought unbreakable. Roman forces found a weak point and carved a wound through which they poured like floodwaters. Now the real horror began. The streets of Carthage turned to battlegrounds. No longer a distant siege, it was war in the gutters and homes. The Romans advanced slowly, cautiously, through narrow alleys and broken doorways. Every house was a fortress, every window a watchtower. The defenders knew the city better than any map, and they fought not to survive, but to make the enemy remember them all. It was hand to hand, eye to eye, rooms lit with fire, floors slick with blood. Carthaginian fighters used rooftops and cellars, setting traps, striking from shadows. Roman soldiers, trained and armoured, pushed back with brutal discipline, burning as they moved forward. Days turned into nights. The city was no longer whole. It was rubble, ash, echo. The air thickened with smoke. And still, the fight continued, room to room, heart to heart. Even as Roman banners flew higher, they flew through flames. Scipio advanced through the wreckage, seeing not just victory but devastation. It was not the war he wanted, but the war Rome demanded. Carthage had chosen fire over chains, and now it burned from within. Each street conquered was a scar carved into the city's soul. The defenders, fewer each hour, retreated toward the highest grounds, toward the temples, toward the gods. Copy 215 from Very Contents, The Last Prayer. In the final hours, as the sky turned orange with flame and black with smoke, the people of Carthage gathered in the temple of Eshmun. Once a place of healing, it now stood as a place of farewell. The high priests stood beside mothers, warriors and children. Their clothes were torn, their hands clasped in prayer. They faced east toward the rising sun, though they knew they would not live to see it. They prayed not for victory, but for remembrance, that their gods would hear and not forget, that their ancestors would welcome them, that the soil would hold their bones in peace. The walls shook, a door splintered, Roman feet stepped across sacred stone. No miracle came, no divine answer, only silence. Scipio, upon reaching the heart of Carthage, saw the temple's ruins, the scorched remains of the last prayers spoken aloud. Some say he wept. Others say he whispered lines from Homer, mourning a noble enemy. But whatever he felt, the work was done.
Carthage, proud, defiant Carthage, had fallen. The city burned for 17 days. Ash rained down where olives once grew. The harbour that had once reached across the seas now stood empty, its waters black with soot. Survivors were taken into slavery. The land, by order of the Senate, was cursed. A city that had stood for centuries was no more. But some say the wind still carries voices. Not cries of pain, but songs of defiance. For though Carthage fell in fire, she did not fall in silence. Chapter 15. Carthago delenda est. It ended not with surrender, but with silence. When the fires were finally out and the smoke no longer rose in thick curtains over the horizon, there was nothing left of Carthage but ash. The city that once ruled the western seas, that had stood as a rival to mighty Rome for over 100 years, now lay in ruins, a blackened carcass on the shore of North Africa. The final siege was over, but the punishment had only begun. The Romans moved through what remained with cold purpose. There was no rebuilding, no sparing of sacred places. Homes were torn down, temples gutted. The harbour, once among the finest in the world, was filled with stone and sand. Statues were broken, books burned, and records erased. This was not just destruction, it was erasure, a wiping away of a name, a culture, a voice. Those who survived the flames were not allowed to return to their lives. Over 50,000 Carthaginians, men, women, and children, were led away in chains, sold into slavery. The city's defenders, though brave, were slaughtered in the final moments, and the few who remained hidden in ruins were soon dragged out, broken and starving. Their only crime had been that they lived in Carthage. It is said, though no Roman record confirms it, that the soil around the city was salted, cursed so nothing could grow again. Whether this was fact or legend hardly matters. The meaning was the same. Rome wanted the world to know that Carthage was gone and would never rise again. This was not just the end of a war, it was the end of an idea. The idea that Rome could be challenged, that any power could stand beside her as equal. Now, the horizon was clear, and though the wind still carried traces of smoke, the sound that lingered longer was silence. Scipio weeps. Among the soldiers who stood in the ruins was Scipio Aemilianus, the Roman general who had brought Carthage to its knees. He was young, strong and victorious, praised by the Senate, hailed by the legions. But as he looked upon the blackened stones and the hollow shells of temples, something shifted in his chest. This was not the joy of conquest. It was something colder, heavier. Regret. According to later accounts, Scipio watched the flames rise and whispered a line from Homer. A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish and Priam and his people shall be slain. He knew history. He knew that every great city believed itself eternal, until it was not. And as he looked upon the ruins of Carthage, he did not see an enemy defeated. He saw a mirror, a warning. If this could happen to Carthage, could it not happen to Rome? His men cheered. The Senate waited to shower him with honours, but Scipio's heart was unsettled. War had brought in glory, yes, but it had also taught him how thin the line was between power and pride. He had burned a city to protect another, and in doing so he had glimpsed the future, not in marble triumph, but in smoke and rubble. In that moment, he did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had buried something too great to name. What was gained? 3 wars. Over 100 years of hatred. Generations born and buried between battles. What had it all bought? Rome had won, undeniably. She now controlled not just Italy, but the western Mediterranean. Carthage was destroyed, her navy scattered, her trade silenced. The islands of Corsica, Sardinia and Sicily were Roman. North Africa would become a Roman province. Spain too, with its silver mines and strongholds. In every measure of land and power, Rome had grown. But behind the numbers were wounds. The cost had been immense. In soldiers, in coin, in time, in soul. The First Punic War had dragged on for 2 decades. The second had brought Hannibal to Italy's doorstep, costing tens of thousands of lives. The third, though shorter, ended with the kind of destruction that leaves a scar on history itself.
Glory had been won, but at what cost?
Rome had become a different kind of republic, one with far-reaching ambitions and an even deeper appetite for dominance. The wars had made her stronger, but also more ruthless. Conquest was no longer a necessity, it was a pattern. And Carthage? Carthage had taught Rome what fear felt like, and in that fear Rome had learned to be merciless. The lessons were clear. Strength was survival, and mercy, once given, might one day return as vengeance. So Rome chose to destroy, not forgive, to bury, not rebuild. It was a lesson they would teach again, in Gaul, in Judea, in countless lands yet to fall under the Roman banner. But some Romans, like Scipio, would wonder in quiet moments, was this what greatness looked like? Or was it just the shadow of something they could no longer see? Echoes in the sea. Carthage gone, the sea changed. The great blue waters of the western Mediterranean, once filled with merchant fleets flying the Phoenician colours, now flew Roman standards. Islands that once listened to Carthaginian governors now answered to Roman prefects. The waves, once patrolled by two powers, now heard only one voice. But even when cities fall, their stories do not always vanish. Beneath the sea, the harbours of Carthage still slept, covered in silt but not forgotten. Along the coast, the winds sometimes seemed to whisper words in an older tongue, and sailors, though loyal to Rome, still spoke in hushed tones of the great city that once ruled the waves. The ghosts of Carthage were not seen, but they were felt, in the rhythm of the tides, in the echo of gulls above ruined shores, in the silence where once there had been music and prayer. And as Rome expanded, into Gaul, into Egypt, across seas and deserts, she carried with her not just banners and laws, but the memory of Carthage. It lived as a caution, a whisper in the ear of every general and senator, that greatness is never safe, that every empire is only one war away from ruin. In time, Rome too would fall, not to Carthage, but to forces just as determined, just as patient. The empire would crack, and the silence Carthage once knew would find a new home. But even then, Carthage would not be forgotten. She had burned, yes, she had vanished, yes, but she had shaped the world before she fell. And sometimes that is legacy enough. Chapter 16. The Mercenary War. The war had ended, but peace did not bring joy to the streets of Carthage. The First Punic War had drained the city of its riches, its strength, and its pride. Carthage, though once feared across the Mediterranean, now stood weakened, its navy shattered, its trade slowed, and its people wearied by years of bloodshed. The final defeat in Sicily had been bitter, and the burden of Rome's heavy demands weighed upon the Carthaginian treasury. But it was not only Rome that came to collect. From across the sea, ship after ship arrived, carrying the very men who had won Carthage's battles, soldiers of fortune, drawn from Numidia, Iberia, Gaul, and beyond. These were mercenaries, men who had risked their lives for gold, not for glory or country. They had spilled blood in Sicily, held the line against Roman legions, and buried their brothers in foreign earth. Now, they returned home with the war behind them, but the promise of pay ahead. Yet, what awaited them in Carthage was not reward, but silence. The gates were opened, but the treasury doors remained closed. The Carthaginian officials, uncertain and overwhelmed, asked for patience. There was not enough silver, they said, not yet. The payments would come, they insisted, only not today. But the mercenaries had waited long enough. What had once been loyalty turned quickly into tension. These men, hardened by years of fighting, were not used to waiting. They had endured hunger in the mountains of Sicily, storms at sea, and ambushes in the dark. They had followed Carthaginian generals into fire and death, and now, under the sun of their supposed reward, they were told to wait without answers. The city tried to scatter them, sending them to a nearby town, Sicca, far from the heart of Carthage. The move was meant to buy time, to calm tempers, but distance only grew the anger. In Sicca they spoke among themselves, remembering promises, counting the lives lost, and watching the days slip by without a single coin handed out. Promises unkept are the seeds of rebellion, and Carthage had planted many. The pay refused. As winter turned to spring, the tension broke. Negotiators were sent, but their offers were too little, too late. The mercenaries demanded full payment, not empty words or clever excuses. The Carthaginian leaders tried to argue, to reduce the amount, to reason. But reason does not feed the hungry, and words cannot buy food for families left behind. Among the mercenaries, new leaders rose, men like Spendius, a runaway Roman slave, and Mathos, a fierce Libyan warrior. They no longer trusted Carthage. In their eyes, this was not just neglect, it was betrayal. These men, once united under the Carthaginian banner, now found unity in fury. They took up arms not as soldiers hired by a city, but as enemies of the state that had used them and cast them aside. When the Carthaginian envoy Gisco arrived, he tried to bring peace. He offered partial payment and calm words, but the rebels took him hostage instead. Diplomacy had failed. The chain of trust had snapped. The rebellion spread like fire. Mercenaries stationed across Africa joined in. Local tribes, long burdened by Carthaginian taxes, now saw a chance to rise. It was not just a mutiny, it was a war. The Carthaginian Senate, caught off guard and still recovering from its losses in Sicily, hesitated. It sent small forces to push back the rebels, but they were crushed. Each defeat fueled the rebels' belief that Carthage was weak, and the city's silence in the face of insult only emboldened the revolt. As the months passed, the rebellion hardened. It gained shape, leadership, and a voice. What began as a demand for wages became a cry for vengeance. The mercenaries were no longer asking, they were marching. Towns loyal to Carthage were taken, Carthaginian troops were slaughtered, and the rebellion gathered momentum like a storm. The city that once ruled the western seas now faced a terrifying truth. The very men it had trained, paid, and relied upon were now marching back, not to protect it, but to destroy it. Siege of Carthage. The unthinkable became real. The rebels surrounded Carthage itself. Camps sprang up outside its mighty walls. Fires burned through the night, and war drums echoed in the still air. The siege had begun. Inside the city, fear ran deep. Carthage had withstood many enemies, but never one born from within. These were not foreign invaders with unknown tactics. These were men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Carthaginian generals. They knew the city's strengths and its weaknesses. The siege was brutal. The rebels cut off supply routes and blocked all exits. Carthage, once a centre of trade and abundance, began to starve. Grain became precious, water scarce. The city looked inward, its people quiet, its markets silent. But Carthage did not fall easily. The city's defences were ancient and strong, its walls high and thick. Within those walls were still warriors, commanders and leaders who had not forgotten how to fight, and chief among them was Hamilcar Barca. Though humiliated by Rome after the First Punic War, Hamilcar had remained a powerful presence. He had led the final Carthaginian campaigns in Sicily. He had seen defeat, but not surrender. Now he was called upon once more, not as a diplomat, but as a man of war. As the rebels tightened their grip, Carthage turned to Hamilcar to break the siege, and he did not hesitate. With sharp strategy and quiet fury, he began to strike back, not just at the rebels' bodies, but at their spirit. Hamilcar's redemption. Hamilcar understood the rebels. He had led them once. He had seen their hunger, their courage, and their violence. But he also knew how to defeat them. He began not with a full assault, but with careful planning. He gathered loyal troops, rebuilt supply lines, and waited for weakness. Then, in sudden bursts of movement, he attacked. One by one, rebel camps fell. Hamilcar took prisoners not to ransom, but to silence. He made no speeches. He offered no deals. This was not a war of politics. It was a war to save Carthage's soul. And in Hamilcar's mind, mercy had no place in a war without rules. It became known as the Truceless War, not just because of the fighting, but because no truces were honoured, no prisoners spared. Both sides committed horrors, but slowly, painfully, Hamilcar began to win. He turned the rebels' tactics against them, luring them into traps, starving their forces, cutting their lines. Villages that had supported the mercenaries were punished, allies were broken. The final blow came when the rebel leaders, Spendius, Mathos and others, were captured. Their deaths were brutal, designed not for justice but for warning. Their bodies were displayed as a message: rebellion would not be forgotten, and would never be forgiven. Hamilcar had done more than defeat the rebels. He had cleansed Carthage of the shame that came after Sicily. The city, once surrounded and starving, now stood firm once more, its enemies gone, its walls intact. And though the peace that followed was uneasy, the memory of the mercenary war would never fade. It had shown the cost of breaking promises. It had shown that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from enemies far away, but from those who once stood beside you. In the silence after the storm, Carthage took a deep breath. Its survival had come at a heavy price, but it had survived, and from the ashes of betrayal, it would rise again, this time under the shadow of a man named Hamilcar, and the legacy of a son who would carry his fire forward. Chapter 17. Hannibal's Campaign of Terror. It began not with a scream, but with silence. From the shadows of the Alps, through forest, fog and frost, Hannibal came. His army was unlike anything the Romans had seen. Hardened Iberians, fierce Gauls, grim-faced veterans of a long and winding war. And at its heart, the man who would come to haunt Roman dreams, Hannibal Barca. His journey across the Alps had already become the stuff of legend. Elephants climbing where even goats feared to tread, soldiers freezing in the snow, slipping on ice, fighting both nature and their own fear. But when he reached the northern plains of Italy, Hannibal did not rest. He did not wait. He struck. The land ahead was unfamiliar to his men, but it did not slow them. They moved like shadows across the countryside, swift, silent and merciless. Fields were trampled, roads were shattered, towns that dared resist vanished under fire and steel. He was not trying to hold ground, he was trying to unnerve a nation. No wall was high enough, no road was safe. Romans who once thought themselves untouchable now whispered of a general who crossed mountains with beasts and ghosts, a man who brought Africa to Italy with fire in his eyes. He knew where the Roman armies were. He knew their movements before they made them. His marches were not straight paths of conquest, but swirling dances of confusion and destruction. He left no clear target. He created no obvious trail. One moment, he was in the north, the next, he was behind enemy lines. It was not a campaign, it was a nightmare. In towns across Italy, children woke to distant drums, farmers fled at the sound of hooves, fires lit the sky in strange, flickering hues. The Romans had never seen war like this. Hannibal had not come to conquer cities. He had come to break the Roman soul. Trebia and Trasimene. At the river Trebia, the trap was set. Roman soldiers, proud and confident, marched into icy water under the morning sun. They believed they were chasing a retreating enemy. Instead, they were being drawn into a grave. Hannibal had placed his cavalry on the flanks, his infantry in the centre, and hidden in the reeds his brother Mago with a force of ambushers. The Romans, cold and wet, advanced eagerly. But when the signal came, the trap snapped shut. From behind, Mago's men erupted, and panic took root. The Romans, surrounded and cut off, slipped in mud and blood. Screams rose above the clash of weapons. By day's end, thousands of Rome's finest had fallen, their armour glinting beneath the winter sky. Then came Lake Trasimene, a place of mist and quiet hills. The Roman general Flaminius marched through a narrow pass, the lake to one side, cliffs to the other. It should have been a cautious march, but Rome had not yet learned caution. At dawn the fog clung to the ground like a whisper. Flaminius's army moved forward, unaware that Hannibal's forces lined the hills above them. Then, with no warning, the hills came alive. Barbarian roars thundered through the fog. Missiles rained down. Cavalry charged from the rear. Roman soldiers trapped between lake and steel drowned in panic. Some tried to swim, others fell without ever seeing their killers. It was not just a battle, it was slaughter. The entire Roman force was wiped out, caught in a perfect storm of terrain planning and fear. The message was clear. Hannibal was not just a general, he was a force of nature. Rome had suffered defeats before, but not like this, never like this. Now, senators spoke in hushed tones. People looked to the hills and saw ghosts. The siege that never came. After Trasimene, the road to Rome stood open. No great army blocked Hannibal, no fort lay in his way. The city itself seemed within reach, and yet he did not attack. To many it seemed madness. Why march so far only to stop at the gates? But Hannibal understood something deeper. Rome was not just a city of stone, it was a system of power, a web of alliances, a soul that lived beyond its walls. Taking the city might have won him a battle, but it would not win him the war. He needed more than walls, he needed Italy to turn. So he turned his focus to Rome's allies. He moved through the countryside like a shadow, offering freedom to those bound to Roman control. Towns that surrendered were spared, those that resisted were punished. His war was not against buildings, but beliefs. By not attacking Rome directly, Hannibal showed his strength in another way. He did not need to strike its heart to make it bleed. Each victory in the fields, each burning village, each whisper of fear, these were his siege weapons. Rome expected war to follow rules. Cities attacked, walls climbed, treaties signed. Hannibal rewrote those rules. He showed that a city could be shaken from the outside, broken without being touched. And in Rome, this choice haunted the Senate, not because they were safe, but because they knew safety was no longer real. Rome had not been spared, it had been measured, and left, for now, to wonder why. The War of Minds. With every passing season, the Romans began to change. They had once met Hannibal with pride, with tradition, with rigid strength, but now they began to learn. In the early days, Rome had rushed to face him head-on, and bled for it. Now they studied him. They watched his moves, tracked his supply lines, measured his methods. The Republic had bled, but it had not died. In response to fear, Rome built something colder. They appointed Fabius Maximus, the Cunctator, the Delayer. He did not chase Hannibal, he shadowed him, he avoided direct battles, he let the Carthaginian forces wear themselves thin in foreign lands. This was a war of minds now. Hannibal had brilliance, speed and surprise, but Rome had patience and Rome had time. As Hannibal roamed the countryside, his enemies stayed just out of reach. No great battle came, supplies grew thin, allies grew cautious, and Rome, once frantic, now watched in silence. It was a slow tightening, a quiet strategy. Not the kind that wins glory, but the kind that wins wars. And yet Hannibal's campaign was far from over. His greatest victory still lay ahead at Cannae, a day when Roman blood would darken the earth. But even in that triumph, the tide had begun to shift. For Hannibal had awoken something dark in Rome, not fear, but focus. A city that had known comfort now learned suffering. A people who had once believed they could not lose now fought not for pride, but for survival. And when a republic fights for survival, it does not forget. In time, Hannibal's flame would flicker. His victories, so sharp and sudden, would give way to a war of attrition. And while his brilliance lit the sky, Rome, quiet, steady and ruthless, was learning how to endure the night. Chapter 18. The Eternal Aftermath. The city was gone, but its spirit lingered. Carthage did not fall quietly, nor did it vanish from memory. Long after Roman legions crushed its walls, and long after flames turned its temples to ash, the name Carthage stirred something deep in the Roman soul. A mix of fear, guilt, and awe. The ruins that once stood along the Tunisian shore were more than stone. They became a warning, a whisper carried by the desert winds. Travellers claimed the land where Carthage stood was cursed, salted by the Romans to make it barren forever, though historians debate if the salt was ever truly spread. Still, the story endured. Like many myths, it said more about fear than fact. Roman children grew up hearing of Hannibal's crossing, how elephants appeared in the Alps like monsters from a forgotten age. Parents told these tales not only to thrill, but to warn. Greatness is fragile, and enemies rise when pride grows. For generations, Carthage was the enemy that justified armies, walls, and conquest. Even after its end, it lived on as an invisible opponent, a ghost carved into Roman memory. In literature and lore, Carthage came to symbolize what happens when one challenges Rome. It wasn't just a fallen city, it was a lesson. Roman writers like Livy and Cicero reflected on it as a mirror a tragic figure that might in another life have been Rome itself. Carthage showed what could happen to any city, no matter how rich or mighty, when it lost favour with the fates. And in private some Romans wondered, if Carthage could fall, could Rome? The myth of Carthage became eternal, not through its survival, but through its ruin. In losing everything, it left behind something deeper, a legend. Salted fields, fallen towers, and a silence that never fully went away. Rome transformed. One might, victory comes at a cost, even for the victor. Rome won the Punic Wars, first in Sicily, then in Spain, and finally on the ashes of Carthage itself. But what it gained was more than land. It gained hunger. The wars changed Rome's view of power. Before, Rome had fought mostly to defend itself, to survive against nearby threats. But now, war was no longer just defense. It became strategy. Expansion became a habit, and habits, once formed, shape nations. The republic that had once been wary of kings now controlled territories too large for senators to manage from afar. As Rome claimed Carthage's colonies and its trade routes, it needed more governors, more soldiers, and more taxes. Power centralized, decisions grew distant. Generals began to act as rulers in faraway provinces, and, in time, these generals would no longer bow easily to the Senate's will. The Punic Wars also strained Rome's values. Where once honour and duty had guided policy, now ambition and wealth often steered the ship. Roman elites, enriched by spoils from Africa and Spain, bought up farmland and filled the city with slaves. Small farmers returned from war to find themselves broken. Their lands taken, their voices diminished. The gap between rich and poor widened, and Rome's famed balance between patricians and plebeians, between senate and citizen, began to tilt. At the same time, Rome's military spirit hardened. Mercy, once praised, began to look like weakness. The total destruction of Carthage, its people slaughtered or sold, became a model for future wars. If Rome had once believed in sparing the defeated, now it believed in making examples. It sent a message, resist and you will be erased. So, while Rome grew stronger, it also grew darker. The ashes of Carthage settled in its heart. As a trophy, yes, but also as a wound. A reminder that victory changes more than maps. It changes minds. The lesson of hate. At its beginning, the conflict was a matter of trade and territory. A dispute over Sicily, a naval clash, a struggle for control over seas and markets. But across decades, the Punic Wars became something far more dangerous. A story shaped not by reason, but by fear. What began as competition turned into obsession. Rome came to fear Carthage's return. Carthage feared Roman revenge. The wars fed on themselves until each side believed only the other's destruction could bring peace. The tale of Hannibal embodies this shift. A brilliant commander, raised from childhood to hate Rome. He crossed mountains not just with elephants but with the burden of legacy, his father's promise, his city's pride, his own oath to never forgive. His victories stunned Rome, and his near success created a scar the Republic could never forget. Even after his exile, even after Carthage tried to distance itself from him, the Romans saw him as the symbol of what they feared most, a rival who dared to challenge their future. And from that fear, hatred grew. The Roman senator Cato ended every speech with the same words: Carthage must be destroyed. No matter the topic, taxes, roads, grain, the cry remained the same. It wasn't logic, it was obsession. It was as if Rome could not rest while Carthage breathed. In the end, that hatred won, and it wiped Carthage from the map. But it also showed the cost of letting fear rule policy. The Punic Wars remind us that nations can forget why they fight. That hate, once ignited, has no natural end. It burns through cities. It burns through time. ... When Rome destroyed Carthage, it thought it had found peace. But the silence that followed was uneasy. For hate, when used as a weapon, leaves something behind. It leaves the fear that it might return. A sea between them. The Mediterranean had long been a place of many voices.
Greek poets, Phoenician traders, Egyptian priests all had crossed its waters, but now it was Roman. The Romans called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. From the shores of Hispania to the hills of Syria, their power stretched like a shadow across the waves. Ships flew Roman flags, ports spoke Latin, laws, weights and coins bore the seal of the Republic.
The sea, once a place of equal trade, had become a road of Roman dominance. Pirates were hunted down. Islands were garrisoned. The coastlines became part of a system that fed Rome's growing appetite. Olive oil, grain, slaves, they all flowed toward the heart of the empire, and in return Rome sent out its culture, its order, its way of life. But peace across the Mediterranean was not peace in full. Beneath the surface, storms still brewed. Local kings bristled under Roman control. Provinces felt the strain of tribute and rule from afar, and within Rome the cracks were beginning to show. Veterans with no land, senators with too much power, ambitious generals whose loyalty bent toward gold and glory rather than law. The sea, though calm, was only resting. Just as Rome had once feared Carthage, it now began to fear itself. Civil war would rise, dictators would follow, the Republic would change, not from invasion, but from within. Still, for a time, the waters were quiet. The Punic Wars were over, the great battles had ended, and for those who lived along the shores, farmers, sailors, merchants, the silence felt like relief. They mended their nets, rebuilt their homes, told stories of Hannibal and Scipio by lantern light. They did not know what would come next, but they remembered what had been. And in that remembering, the war lived on. Not in fire, not in banners, but in the space left behind. In the quiet after history.